Bonsoir tout le monde. Merci d'être venus ce soir, toujours aussi nombreux. Ça fait vraiment plaisir de voir ce petit dôme vivre et se remplir tous les jeudis. Enfin, tous les jeudis, on fait des conférences de toujours autant plus de monde et avec toujours des têtes nouvelles. Je trouve ça extraordinaire. Ce soir, nous avons la chance de recevoir non pas un conférencier, mais deux conférenciers. Donc, on a la chance d'inviter Noura Al Sayeh et Holtrop. Comment dire ? Donc, Noura, j'essaie de voir un petit peu dans quelle drôle d'idée on avait pour les inviter ensemble. J'avais tout préparé, puis... mais exactement, voilà, c'était un petit peu là, mais je vais m'en sortir. Donc, Noura est architecte, accessoirement architecte EPFL. Elle est architecte et conseillère des projets architecturaux à l'autorité de Bahreïn pour la culture et les antiquités. J'en dis pas plus, après c'est beaucoup trop long ton CV. Et Holtrop, sorry, I'll just speak in French because my English is absolutely a disaster. So Holtrop, and I can say whatever I want because you don't understand. Okay, it's perfect. So Holtrop is architect and artist. And he works in many places. And also, it's important to say that he's now a professor at EPFL. He's ETH. Oh là là, n'importe quoi. ETH. Donc, on a décidé de les inviter à ce cycle de conférences Simplexité pour la bonne raison qu'en fait, le travail qu'ils font parfois ensemble ou parfois séparés a cette drôle de manière de nous faire croire que tout ce qu'ils font a l'air excessivement simple, alors qu'ils travaillent dans des contextes excessivement complexes. Et donc, les résultats nous laissent l'impression que les choses sont simples. Il suffit juste comme ça de les dessiner, juste de les construire, et que tout va comme ça s'assembler de manière d'une grande simplicité, alors qu'en fait, c'est issu d'un travail d'une grande complexité. Et tout particulièrement le travail de Holtrop, qui est de cette recherche plastique, d'essayer de comprendre un peu la complexité des formes de la nature et de savoir comment est-ce qu'on va arriver à les transposer dans des éléments d'architecture. C'est vraiment ces deux aspects-là qui nous a conduit à inviter notre duo de ce soir. Pour tout ce qui va être la mise en contexte de leur travail, on a la chance d'avoir aujourd'hui Farouk. Voilà, je savais que je n'allais pas le dire. Dirige Chani, non, c'est pas ça. J'étais presque. Qui est le directeur du prix Aga Khan et qui participe, qui est un petit peu un partenaire pour cette conférence et qui va nous donner quelques mots pour contextualiser le travail de Noura et de Hané. Tu as la parole.
Je crois qu'on a beaucoup de chance parce que Marlène n'a pas décidé de parler en chinois parce que ça, c'est la troisième langue. Alors, si vous ne savez pas. Elle parle très bien couramment le chinois. Alors, ici, c'est bon. Je crois que les travaux de Noura et Anne vont expliquer eux-mêmes ce qu'ils font. Mais ce que c'est très important, parce que moi, je suis l'un des témoins, le seul témoin de ce que, voilà, c'est vrai, que j'ai vu toutes les étapes de leur projet, les projets. Alors, ce n'est pas le projet, parce qu'il y a un grand projet, et c'est l'ensemble que c'est important. Et ce que c'est important aussi, c'est la façon qu'il faut que je donne aussi un peu de crédit aux autorités de Bahreïn qui ont croient qu'on peut faire des choses autrement. Autrement, et ça parce que c'est un contexte très, très différent avec tous les autres pays autour de Bahreïn. Et c'est la façon qu'ils ont fait, ils ont mis en valeur de leur site historique, leur contexte, parce que ça c'est très important aussi, parce que malheureusement dans certains pays on a cette habitude que si on touche des choses historiques, il ne faut jamais toucher, il faut le laisser comme il est, etc., avec cette façon de malheureuse les chartes d'Athènes et Venise, etc. Mais et ça, c'est pas vrai, parce que ça, c'est la façon qu'eux, ils ont fait dans ce projet que vous voyez. C'est comment on va amener de nouveaux objets, de nouveaux bâtiments, de nouveaux éléments qui sont bien intégrés. Et il y a une autre chose que c'est très intéressant, que vous voyez, où on est aujourd'hui, dans cette pavillon cyclique, vous voyez des choses très similaires dans leur projet. Je ne sais pas qui a pris des idées des autres, mais voilà. Mais quand même, de nouveau, vous dire que leur travail dans la région, c'est très important, et puis leur approche. Et spécialement parce qu'avec Noura, je peux expliquer un peu, parce qu'elle a eu un rôle très important, à part que son meilleur, comment on dit en anglais, the better half, il est là, mais elle a choisi des architectes, des différents architectes, de venir et collaborer ensemble dans un projet. Avoir différents architectes, différentes personnes ensemble, et puis, comme on dit en anglais, comme un curator. Elle a choisi ces gens de mettre ensemble. Et ça, c'est très important. C'est un travail que je crois que c'est remarquable. Merci. Et voilà, à toi.
Merci. You can start now. OK. Merci beaucoup. Merci à Marlène, à l'équipe du Pavillon Sikli et à Farouk pour cette belle introduction. Et comme on disait avant, c'était une très belle idée qu'elle a eue à Marlène, parce que c'est la seulement deuxième conférence jointe qu'on donne. So we chose to share with you today 3 different projects that we jointly worked in different capacities. In Bahrain, where I've been working as Marlène and Farouk introduced from 2009 with what was then the Ministry of Culture and is today the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities, where I've been working mainly on the architecture projects, whether it is curating or commissioning, working on urban rehabilitation projects, so in many different capacities, but all related to the practice of architecture. So the first project we're going to talk to you about, which was the first project that we got introduced to, Anne and myself, is the Bahrain Pavilion at the Expo Milan in 2015. So it was Bahrain's first participation in an expo ever. We started quite late. I think it was in 2013 that there were the first discussions to participate. I'm a big procrastinator, so I lost a lot of time, although we were very late already on schedule, maybe 6 months. And then I spent the other 6 months of that year trying to convince everyone, and namely the president, the minister of the time, Sheikh Hamay, that it was actually a waste of money participating in an expo because they're completely irrelevant, and that it would be much better that we use this money to build something in Bahrain. And I tried for 6 months, delaying this process and this project, and unsuccessfully, because they were very convinced that they did want to participate in the expo. And so then I had the added challenge of not really knowing how to go about this commission, having no time at all, and wondering how, if you're given this possibility of building a pavilion in an expo, how can you still make it relevant today, beyond the usual practices that have become predominant, that countries use it as nation branding, as a kind of advertisement, and that, architecture has less and less of a role in these expos. So I tried to look back a bit historically to previous expos where there was still a bit of emotion and exoticism associated with expos, and there was still a bit of beauty and interesting architecture produced on that, and specifically looking at the way countries from the Arab world were representing themselves in these international exhibitions. So there's many beautiful examples, such as the Egyptian participation in 1893 in Chicago called the Streets of Cairo, where they completely recreated an old quarter of the historic city of Cairo. The Lebanese pavilion in the New World Fair in New York in 1939, where they used a lot of scented wood that was very using scents and evocation, and trying to think how can we think of a pavilion in this way. So we started looking at Bahrain somehow also through this romanticized lens. The theme of the expo that year was feeding the planet, food for life. So it was on food security, on agriculture, agrarian heritage, and so on. And what little people know is that Bahrain is actually not a desert island. It's not an island where camels roam. It was actually, until the 1980s, the breadbasket of the Gulf region. It was an island that was known as the island of the million palm trees. It's cited in the Bible as the location of the Garden of Eden. So it has an incredibly rich agrarian heritage that is very little known about. due to the fact that Bahrain has sweetwater wells that are present that have enabled up until recently the development of this extremely lush vegetation. So this is a map of Bahrain in the 1930s, where you can see the extent of the agrarian coverage and the green areas on the island, and the way it was essentially a very fertile land. You can imagine what happened next from the 1930s. In 1932, oil was discovered in Bahrain, rampant urbanization. Today, around, you can see it on this map, probably around 5% of the agrarian areas remain. And so when you think about how you represent a country elsewhere, obviously it's important how you communicate this country to the wider world. But for us in Bahrain, it's also really important how we use these international participations to bring awareness to issues that are sometimes difficult to talk about locally, and using this international platform to bring to the forefront issues related to urban development, the loss of agrarian areas that are really important to talk about, but maybe a bit complicated to talk about locally. So we started looking at the participation through this romantic lens, but also trying to understand how this is reflected in the contemporary scenes of Bahrain. Looking at what remnants there are of this agrarian heritage, what still exists of it, how relevant it is to Bahrain today, and how we can think of maybe looking at a different future for Bahrain, a different expression of the architecture, the local architecture, working with this agrarian heritage. So we started looking very much into the contemporary aspects of the agrarian heritage in Bahrain and how it's relating to the current situation, but also future issues related to food security. So with that in mind, we organized a small competition between 6 architects, which we gave, because I procrastinated so long, I think they had 6 weeks to prepare the competition, and then from 4, okay, it was really a lot. And then 1 year from then on to build it. And the idea was really to have a pavilion, first of all, that needed to be temporary, recyclable, dismantleable, and that would represent the agrarian heritage in Bahrain, but not in a representative way, by creating a space and a context that would evoke and give a future idea of what the agrarian possibilities were in Bahrain.
What Noura didn't say was we're going to talk about 3 projects. Did you say that? Yeah. Oh, okay, I was then not listening. So I'm going to show you 3 projects as well. So yeah, I remember really well when I got that email from the Bahrain Expo Pavilion team, which was one person, I finally figured out later on, which was Noura. And I was like, Bahrain? So so I had to look it up. And it was my first, let's say, real contact with the country in the Middle East. And since then, I lived there happily for 10 years. I worked from there. I cannot imagine to be anywhere else in the world at this moment. And I will, hopefully, through the projects, maybe you understand a bit why. This is the project as it is at the current moment in Muharraq, in Bahrain, because after the expo we moved it there. But let me tell you a bit about how I entered this competition. That was indeed 4 weeks. First of all, I was away because I was away with my students in India. We were visiting places of production, so I was showing them foundries, recycling slums, textile factories, dyeing factories, as I'm very much interested in how things originate, where things actually come from, where craftsmanship, where production is, where sourcing of material is. So for me, that is really the angle also how I approach architecture. And I thought if I need to make something for a place that I haven't visited yet, I need something that I could frame it with. I need something that somehow is for me a way how to make a logic out of it together. And what I did was I asked in my studio everyone to draw. This was the size of the plot. It was 20 meters by 100 meters long. The plot for the expo. I said, fill it up with arcs and straight lines, no matter what, but don't repeat it. So everyone was drawing and drawing. And at the end, we overlapped drawings, and this was what came out. It was a drawing for me that had a certain kind of complexity and maybe felt in its kind of geometry a bit Islamic. And I thought maybe this is the way how we can start. Maybe this is a kind of blueprint how we can enter this project. And with fragments of these drawings, we started researching from a distance, from Amsterdam, what Bahrain, what we could find about Bahrain, what Google could find for us about Bahrain, and if we could find any similarities between the drawing and that what we were looking at. Formal relationships, like relationship that you would say that one thing identifies with the other. What I didn't say was, for me it was very important that it was a drawing that did not reference anything, a drawing that does not specifically wants to represent by being referential or remaking or representation of something, but a drawing that is open for interpretation, a drawing for me that I can, in my sense, interpret what Bahrain is about. But also I thought for visitors in this expo, it doesn't give you one way of understanding the country. It doesn't represent it in one way because it is very open in the way how it is drawn. This is one of the water wells that Noura also showed. Sadly, doesn't exist anymore. And then when I found this Barbar temple, and the Barbar became, for me, a very important project in my work, I found this, I think Valerio Odiatis told me, you were so lucky you found that ark there in that project. Because suddenly there were these blocks, there were all these different kind of blocks of stone, there was this ark, a kind of fragment of a water well. And I thought, yeah, maybe that drawing is literally the blueprint, the building drawing of this pavilion. I do not have to translate it anymore. I just use it as its building stone pieces, and that's what we did. So the drawing became the project is in a white casted prefabricated concrete, and all the elements from the floors, the walls, the roof slabs are literally taken from that drawing. There's nothing deviated anymore from it. And here you see, let's say, the ground floor plan of all the floor slabs throughout the project. So what is drawn here in red, or kind of pinkish red, is the built elements. The white is the open elements, as we propose to present the gardens, as we wanted to have gardens in this project that were planted with fruit trees that are native to Bahrain. We did this with the landscape architect Anouk Vogel. But it was very nice to figure out a plan where you do not have to define yourself a form of a space, or you not have to define, okay, this should represent that, but actually it's almost accidental in the way of discovering through it. From the outside, the building looked very bare. There was actually, we just wanted to exclude ourselves from the expo. So it was a closed-off wall where then from above trees would pop out. And then this would be the entrance. And the spaces were, the spaces are, I said, I should not talk in the passive form because this building still exists. The spaces are very, they move and turn and bend and get narrow and widen and move you through the building. Where the building has no glass, no windows, everything is open. So the apertures are all direct relationship with the gardens. And these gardens were fully planted with, let's say, papaya and banana trees to date palms, jujube, pomegranate, fig trees, Indian fig, etc. And what was really nice is that this expo lasted from spring to autumn. So when we planted it, it really, in the beginning, I think almost at the opening, that was really beautiful, the citrus blossom, and you could smell the pavilion even when you were outside and you were approaching it, until you had autumn situations with the beautiful leaves, etc. With the fruits in the kitchen, with the Bahraini chef, was almost literally cooking with the produce of these gardens. Of course, not sufficiently, but you know, you felt the relationship with it. And there was a beautiful, when Sheikh Hamid, the Minister of Culture, visited the project at the opening, she said, "It feels so familiar, but I haven't seen it in this form yet. I do not know the place as it is, but I feel so much at home." And I thought that was really beautiful. For me, a very beautiful summary of what I try to do is to invent a new version of, build upon something that it is based on. What we were also able to do was that we could show pieces from the National Museum, from the collection. So we had old pieces from the Tylers period, for instance, shown in showcases while you were having the wind passing through the pavilion, while you were smelling the blossom, etc. So there's, you know, when you go to a museum, it becomes very excluded from a reality. And here I found, you know, pieces that were 2,000 years old became very much alive in the way how you would experience them, how you would engage with them. And another part of the content was we asked Armin Linke, photographer and filmmaker, to visit Bahrain and to make a film work. Shall I continue that, or you wanted to pick up on it? Oh, I forgot the order. We made the order an hour ago, I think, in the hotel. We asked him to visit Bahrain with his team and to visit, we thought, the farms and the things that related direct to the farm. But when you invite Armin Linke, everything relates to everything. So his name Linke is quite precise because he links everything. So it was really beautiful how with his photography eye and film eye, he started weaving a narrative, and also an open narrative of everything that we visited on this trip, from traditional farms to even the aluminium smelter. Things started to connect in Bahrain, and this was then a film of 1 hour long that we showed as part of the content. I show you a 3-minute expert, so you get a bit of feel of what was then going on.
So as I was saying before, and I presented his project, the idea for the competition was to have a lightweight, recyclable, dismantleable pavilion, and yet we chose one that was designed in concrete, that was not recyclable and not dismantleable or reusable. So at the very start of the competition, you know, we were very convinced that this was by far the best project. We thought, you know, how can this still make sense and be sustainable in a way that we don't need to, you know, dismantle and destroy everything after 6 months. So we asked Anne early on if he could work on the pavilion in a way that everything could be dismantleable, shipped back to Bahrain at the end of the expo and built again. So we went ahead with this, although we were working with a very limited budget, but we actually did not have a land in Bahrain where this project could actually fit because it had not been commissioned like that. Around that same time, in 2015, I started working on the purling path that Farouk spoke about early on in Muharraq, one of the old centers of Bahrain, in a very historic center. And we were starting to plan that project, which is quite a large-scale project that I will talk about at the end of the talk. And as I was going through the maps, I saw that there was this land that looked like it had roughly the same proportions as our pavilion in Milan. And so I think maybe 3-4 months into the process, we asked Anne to check if the pavilion would fit into this plot. And miraculously, the pavilion had nearly exactly the same dimensions as this plot in the very historic center of Muharraq. And it related really quite beautifully because you can see this building that you see here to the right, which is the house of the former ruler of Bahrain, Sheikh Isa bin Ali, which is a very traditional Bahraini house made out of courtyards. And I think, like Anna said, because the pavilion itself was in a way inspired, but not in a direct sense, by the traditional architecture of Bahrain. Intrinsically, it had a lot of the qualities and proportions of the traditional architecture. And we were able to move it back and build it in this very dense urban center of Muharraq, where it serves today as a public botanical garden in the heart of the city. That reinterprets in a more contemporary way the traditional courtyard houses that traditionally in the city, and you can see a few of them here, had most of the greenery that was present in the city. So it was a nice life cycle of this project. The second series of projects that we will talk about are centered in a different part of Bahrain, in Manama. And it's an area that I started working with Leopold Manchini, who's here, in 2012. 2012, if you remember now it sounds like history, but 2012 happened right after 2011, where across the Arab world there was a series of social and political uprisings that had obviously a very considerable effect on many aspects of life, and specifically in Bahrain, where there was actually quite a large uprising. Coincidentally, that same year, Manama, the capital of Bahrain, had been named capital of Arab culture, and we were tasked at the ministry to come up with a series of programming according to different themes every month of the year. And February was the month that was allocated to architecture, so I had been requested to come up with a program, a series of events, workshops, and so on, that would tackle the theme of architecture in Bahrain. And obviously, you know, this was quite challenging in many aspects, but also quite interesting, obviously, to do this in the direct aftermath of such an event. And what happened specifically across the Arab world, and maybe more specifically in the Gulf, is that because these kind of uprisings happened that surprised everyone, there became in public spheres mainly this kind of general fear of public space. You know, it was like as if that because public space was there, these things happened. And so, you know, in planning meetings that I was involved in, it became very contentious to say anything about public space. If you started speaking about public space, it became a dangerous thing. You know, we believe that this was a very troubling and dangerous development, and that somehow we should do something to work with public space, but to make it boring in a way again, you know, to make public space what it should be, a kind of didactic, you know, urban planning tool, and not something that is contentious and problematic. So we started thinking of organizing an open competition to rethink what public space could look like in the Arab world in the aftermath of these events, and more generally in the 21st century. So we started thinking about which space in Bahrain, specifically in Manama, could be an interesting location to rethink what a public space could be, let's say at the scale of the city and the country, a representational public space. So there was this very large area that you see here, quite in the center of the city, that is currently, and it still is, a very large parking space in the very heart of the city that we thought could be the ideal location to start rethinking how could this be transformed into a public space. So we organized with Leopold, that's here, an open ideas competition. I think it was quite successful. We got like around 250 participations from across the Arab world, and internationally actually, which was really quite encouraging. And in order to display these competitions and to talk about public space, we decided to do an intervention on part of the site of this public space, which incidentally was a roundabout, which also was quite symbolic because a lot of the movements across the Arab world happened around roundabouts, specifically actually because there was not so many public space, and the most visible public spaces were actually the ones where cars were circulating. So we created this shaded canopy that created a space under the roundabout. The pavilion itself is constructed out of agricultural covering mesh that they used to cover the fields in. You would have seen a close-up of it in the video of Armin. It's the same kind of coverings. And the idea was, through creating this temporary intervention on this public space that was not announced actually. It was just, we started building, and then in 2-3 days the space appeared in the city, kind of unannounced. And we displayed under this canopy that through the simple gesture, instead of being just a traffic intersection, started to become a space that had qualities because of the shading, and a space that people could start using. We displayed publicly the results of the competition that had happened for the redesign of the whole area, and encouraged people to engage with the different participations, and really tried to somehow bring in the issue of planning of public spaces into the public realm and into where people were, specifically because, you know, in Bahrain, it's difficult when you have exhibitions in museum spaces or in specific exhibition spaces. They tend to touch only a very small portion of the population. And it was important for us that this project also in its exhibition would have a much more public nature, and would somehow be a bit of it would be something that you would have to kind of be obliged to go through and obliged to engage with in a way. And obviously cars are a very big part of of culture in Bahrain. Nearly everything was done by car. So we had also, with Leo, thought of the exhibition as being a kind of drive-through exhibition. So, if you were really lazy and you didn't want to go out of your car, you could just roll down the window and look at it as you were passing by. And every evening from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m., we would close off the road, pedestrianize it, and all the exhibition was on wheels. We would bring it back onto the streets of the exhibition. As we were working on this pavilion and starting to look more closely at historic Manama, you will see here on the other side of this image, there is a building that appears here that has this kind of 70s, 80s structural facade. Which is actually the historic custom house and post office of Manama. So you see here, this is a historic image of the area where the pavilion is, where you see 3 buildings that were planned during the 1930s, 1940s. So I have a kind of slightly colonial influence in their architecture, and you see. Here at the edge, what used to be the customs house, so the custom piers that connected the port to the entrance of the Manama city center, which has a building dating from the 1890s, which was one of the first buildings erected here. The building, strangely, in the 1980s, had been covered in an effort to modernize it with this structural facade that had been just kind of glued on the historic building. But somehow across the years, along the years, this had been forgotten, and everyone, I have to say, including us, thought that that the original building had been demolished and this was a building from the 1980s. I was coincidentally and thankfully invited to the Ministry of Transportation because they wanted advice, because they wanted to build a new post office in this location and they needed more space. And so they asked me to come along to give them advice on their proposal, which you can imagine what it looked like. And their question was, we don't know if we should make it more modern or more traditional. So I just took the plans with me. I said, let's think about it. And I went back, and by then we had understood that the original building was behind this added 80s facade. And we managed to then work with them to convince them that we would need, what we should actually do in an effort to reestablish the facades of this public space is to remove this 80s addition, rehabilitate the post office, and work on an extension of the post office that was more coherent with the historic nature of the square. I put number 2.
It should work. So this was when I had just moved to Bahrain, and trying to adjust to a completely new environment, and where everything that you base your life on, that you base your practice on, is not true anymore. So we would, in my studio in Amsterdam, go to a shop and buy cardboard, and we thought in Bahrain we do the same, and then we figured out there is no shop selling cardboard or foam or anything like this. So everything had to start from scratch. So we think, okay, is there not someone producing foam? We can cut it in blocks. Okay, we figured it out. We glue a whole model together. I had an old courtyard house in Bahrain as my studio. So we would always, year-round, work outside. That is in the summer, and the summer is very long in Bahrain. It's a very hot activity. And the next day we would come back to our model making, and everything was melted, glue was melted, everything like that. So it's like I'm just giving you this funny anecdote, but everything had to be, I had to readjust to everything. But at the same time, I think already when I was working with Bas Prince, for instance, on the project that we did in relationship to Petra in Jordan, a very strong interest for countries where there is a very much of a mineral presence, where the minerality of it is laid bare, where there is no vegetation. As I find it really beautiful that you can grab that material, can alter it, can mix it, can shovel it to a mountain. You have the beautiful burial mounds in Bahrain, where the significance comes out how you engage directly with the material that is laid bare straight in front of you. And this project is, I think, the very first attempt to start working with that, and also to start not only from its material base, but also from its way how it is constructed or how it is touched, as this is a project where all the concrete of it that we made with a very local mix. So we used sand locally, we used aggregates locally, a white cement that we could find locally. We start trying to make something that felt like it was born from its place, but I thought in the materiality that is not enough. So I wanted that building really to be touched. So we invented that it should be chiseled. So all the concrete is chiseled, inside, outside, with the hands. And that sounds like torture that I, impose on other people, but it's not such a bad work, because the chisel is very small. It's like a little pin, and there's a little hammer. And every time you give a hit on this pin, but it is a very long activity. So it is months of chiseling. But I thought that this, for me, I wanted to find, to find an answer for this project where the process and where time is an essential part of its project. And that also has to do with the history of that building that Noura was already explaining. This we already have seen. This we also have seen. So it is a building. This is very funny. This was what the building would look like from the interior. So that had this facade kind of glued on something that was a bit older behind it, but also modernized. A history of building where you constantly keep adding, removing, altering, changing. And I thought in the new edition, this should be really part of its essence of what we do. After the renovation was, by the way, done by the Ministry of Culture's intervention team. So they have their own team for restoration. So they are not an commissioning only, but also very active player in working with this. I think it's quite essential to understand that. So then we as architects, we work on the new part, but of course we also work on the rehabilitation of the old. So it's quite a joint work that you see here in its front facade after restoration, or here in the open gallery space on the first floor. How then what you saw here as the reality of that project was this after reconstruction. So that was bringing it back to a state, but that state was not complete. Whereas at the same time also, this is the main post office of Bahrain. The post of Bahrain, the Bahrain Post as they are called, had big ambitions. They thought post will grow, so they thought the building should grow. So they needed this addition, but this addition was also architecturally necessary, as if there was on the right side the main building, but it had already an addition very quickly built upon it that was only this one floor, and there was just a remaining wall. So somehow it needed to be completed. And that completion is the blue part, so it's actually very limited in a way of what we have done and intervened. And I thought that the completion should always look incomplete, so it doesn't fit. So I made this kind of cuts where it touches the existing architecture, or it bends back, or even on its own, it doesn't fit. So there is always this kind of play with something that is complete due to its incompleteness. For me, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if that makes. I always, when I talk to my students, I think, "Oh, this is so clear," and then they look at me very puzzled. You see, so a corner doesn't continue of an existing, but that corner is responded to by another corner that doesn't fit. So that was the kind of way of completing something and also therefore finding form, to give form to that new part in a way by not wanting to control, to continue on that form. So form in a way, in that sense, appears as such. We still have a lot of mailboxes available for one. It's a mailbox in Bahrain. For tax reasons can also be very appealing. Although you also have systems here at Place in Switzerland for that. But and then on the inside, since that part was didn't have a floor left anymore, an existing first floor left anymore, we were able to open up that space and give another spatial dimension to it. And we continued in a way that kind of incompleteness by a column, a central column that continues over the 2 floors. In this kind of form. The concrete is ridiculously thick. It is like 19 centimeters thick. And that had to do that we just thought we built the same thickness of the original walls. And the original walls are built in Bahrain in coral stone. That is very specific to Bahrain. So there is not so much of a stone presence as that you can quarry from the island. A very limited amount of limestone. So to have building material, it's taken from the sea. So coral stone blocks are taken from the sea. Slabs are cut from it. And here it's built with it. And then it's finished with a plaster. And that plaster is a lime plaster that then comes from burning the limestone that is present on the island. But you have hardly no stone building as you might expect to be there. Here you see another photo. And it doesn't show very the screen, but here you see it. So all that relief was this endless soundtrack of little chiseling that happened for months throughout that project. I switch it to you.
Yeah. So the last but longest project we're going to talk about is the Purling Path, which is a very large urban regeneration project that was started in 2009. And in Farouk just reminded me that you can only do 3 projects like this in your life. So this is one of them. There's not many left. It's a It makes me sound really old, yes. But it's a project I've been personally working on for 10 years, since 2015. The Purling Path is a project that was thought of by Sheikh Hamay, the previous Minister of Culture, in 2009, with the idea of safeguarding and having a project that would kind of regenerate the historic island or city of Muharraq in Bahrain. The Muharraq island that you see here was the center of the pearling economy not only in Bahrain, but in the whole Gulf area until the demise of the pearling economy in the 1930s. And what's quite beautiful about Muharraq is that everything that you see built here was built in direct relation to the economy of pearling. So it was a single product economy that built the whole city. So the ambition of the project of the Purling Path was double, of course. On the one hand, it was to bring back to the forefront the cultural identity relating to pearling, which had been so central to Bahrain, but after modernization was not so present anymore. And secondly was to have a project that could serve as a catalyst for the urban regeneration of the island and the historic city of Muharraq. What you see here on your left, I guess, is an image of Muharraq from the 1980s. So you see until how recently so much of the urban fabric was preserved. And this is Muharraq 10 years ago, so not today, but quite recently, where you see how much it's grown, first of all, because of land reclamation, how extensively it's changed, and perhaps, most drastically how much the relationship to the sea of the city has changed. But what is still intact and what you see in this image is that the urban core of the historic city is still quite intact and remains until today the best preserved Islamic historic city in the Arabian side of the Gulf to remain. So there was really a lot of potential in the urban fabric. And one of the first things that was started when we started thinking about the project, or my colleagues did, I wasn't involved at the time, was to start mapping and surveying and understanding the city. This obviously in a Swiss context sounds like something very obvious that you would do. But when we started working on the project, we started in the absence of all this data, you know, that had never been surveyed. There was no survey on the condition of buildings, on who was living in the city, what the functions of buildings were. So the first, let's say, 3-4 years of the project, a lot of work was done to establish special regulations and special zonings that would result in a conservation plan that would introduce special zoning and special urban regulation to the historic city of Muharraq. Prior to us starting working on the project, the inner city of Muharraq was zoned in exactly the same way that a new residential city would have been zoned. So it was zoned as row house building B, row house building A, and you can imagine what consequences this had to the development happening in the city. So this conservation plan, on the basis of it, the master plan of the actual purling path was proposed, which is a series of 17 properties that each relate to one aspect of the purling economy. So there is the house of a diver, the house of a boat builder, the house of a pearl merchant, that are all connected to one another through this pathway. And that was presented to the UNESCO World Heritage List and inscribed in 2012 as a World Heritage Site related to the economy and practices of purling. But the project was quite singular in the way that it had an intangible aspect, which was the heritage of the purling, and a tangible aspect, which was the architectural and physical testimonies of this practice. And the project marries these two things through the city and through this urban rehabilitation project. I started working on this project in 2015, right after the Expo, and when we received the full funding for the project, which was quite a nice time to start working on the project, because there was not a lot of money, but there was at least enough funding to complete the first phase of the project. And we then worked with the team to transform the inscription of the World Heritage Site into a comprehensive plan that would not only look at, let's say, the cultural and touristic needs of the city, but also look at what infrastructure we should add to the project to make sure that the project was also contributing to the liveliness of Muharraq. Although a lot of the architectural fabric of the city, the original fabric from the 1930s, had disappeared, one of the assets of the city was that it's still a living city, it's still a city that's functioning, and it was very important for us that the project does not start to museumify the city or to gear it solely for tourism and culture. So in addition to the actual World Heritage Sites, we started one of the first projects we started working on, and a competition we launched was for the wayfinding system of the path itself. And the project that was selected by Bureau Basmes and Office KGDVS proposed to install a series and a network of public spaces and squares on a series of these blue spaces that you see here, which were voids in the city that were leftover spaces from demolished homes that had not yet been built off. And in most of the cases, they had become kind of informal parking spots within the city. So the project looked into introducing these micro-public spaces into the heart of the city, creating not only a wayfinding system, but a place where the path itself expands to create green public spaces that once they were implemented, there's 17 of them throughout the whole path, have become like public living rooms within the city. The city is composed of many different people, but also workers that live in very congested environments. And these public spaces become one of the very few places that they have where they have a bit of openness, a bit of green, a bit of private space where they can also be a part of the city. Another really important project in terms of the infrastructure of the city was this pedestrian bridge that was built to connect the coastline to the city of Muharraq. It's quite a long bridge that goes over a 6-way highway that you see here, and was and still is the only pedestrian connection between the historic city of Muharraq and the only original coastline that's remaining, that is also part of the project that you see here. So although this didn't directly have anything to do with, let's say, the World Heritage Site nomination, it was really important for us that the project reconnects the city to the sea. And by providing this public bridge, it was really beautiful when we opened it, because it was one of the first time that residents of Muharraq could take their children to the sea walking. So they were a generation for which this was something that happened quite naturally and normally. And when this bridge opened, they could take their children once again and walk from the city to the sea, connecting through this public highway. One of the other larger infrastructural projects is the Visitors Center by Valerio Olgiati, which is in the center of the souk, so the market area of Muharraq. The original commission for this project was a building of 800 square meters, so it was a kind of community center on this very large open land that had been left over. But the project proposed was a 7,000 square meter roofscape that you see here. That we actually, although we had not thought of initially when we commissioned it, was a really important urban gesture for the project on the whole in relation to the city, and has become really important in a way of preserving this very large open public space that's underneath, that serves today to host a lot of festivals that are happening in the city, a lot of different events, and that are really, really somehow preserves this open void in the dense historic center, specifically in an area, you can see here the roof view of it, in an area where there is already a lot of new construction happening and where we anticipate there is going to be even more construction in the future. And so by creating this very large roofscape, we create this kind of very large plaza at the center of the city that protects and preserves this very large public space underneath it. One of the other, and it's funny to show this in this building, but one of the other very large infrastructural projects were the multi-story parkings by Christian Carrots. There's 4 of these multi-story parkings that are built that are mainly aimed at resolving the issue of mobility in the city. One of the largest problems that face the historic city, like in many other historic cities, but maybe specifically in the Gulf region, is that there is a big problem with parking spaces, with mobility. And since we had removed a lot of the parking spaces by introducing public spaces, and we pedestrianized a lot of additional spaces, it was quite important to provide alternative parking spaces in the city. So the parkings, and this is also maybe important to note for us, it was very important for us for these parkings, first of all, obviously to solve part of the parking issues in Muharraq, but also to be thought of as flexible spaces that could be used, hopefully in the future when there is less of a need for parkings, as flexible spaces, as spaces for exhibitions, for performances, so that we could imagine that these buildings could be multi-flexible in their use and that in the near future could also be transformed and reappropriated as something else than a parking space. So you see how these parking spaces are quite, they're actually, we recently commissioned Catherine drone pictures of the path, and we realized that the only thing that you could see really well were these parking spaces, because of the rest of the interventions are quite knitted in the urban fabric. But you know, for us, you know, designing a parking space in a contemporary way and assuming the contemporary nature of both the function that we're introducing to the historic center, but also the way it is assuming its contemporary nature, like Farouk said, was for us also a very important element of the project. You know, while we were very concerned about preserving the architectural and urban heritage, it was equally important for us that whatever we build today, we build in contemporary means and in a way that also reflects society's capabilities, technical capabilities today. So these are, here you see some of the way that these parkings integrate with the city and how closely related all these things are. I think a lot of people, when they visit Muharraq, are kind of surprised by, first of all, how close all the projects are to one another, but also how ingrained within the urban fabric of the city they are. So here you see, this is one of the traditional houses that has been conserved, a public square, and the parking that are all close to one another. Another large part of the project was the rehabilitation of the Souk area, which was done by Anna, which included also the rehabilitation of a series of warehouses. This is a specific warehouse that unfortunately it burnt a few months after we inscribed it on the World Heritage List because of a short circuit in the building. It had still been used as a storage building. And the project, which was led by Anne, rebuilt all the parts that had been destroyed by the fire in concrete exactly along the fire line. So you can follow exactly what parts had been destroyed by the fire and which parts remained original. You know, in addition to the heavy infrastructure, it was also really important for us to also, you know, reintroduce and re-energize somehow the intangible heritage related to the pearling economy. In this case, namely, it was the traditional Fajeri singing, which was the singing that the pearl divers would do on board the boats. And it was something that was still quite present in Muharraq, in areas, in specific buildings called the Dar. But these Dars didn't have a lot of visibility in the city, and the owners of the specific Dar approached us because they wanted a larger performance space, because they sometimes got a lot of visitors and they couldn't accommodate them. And this was something a bit challenging because typologically these musical performances are generally performed in something called the majlis, so quite a closed space. And we didn't want to change the typology of their performance space, but at the same time it was important that it was first of all more visible in the city, and then that it could have a bit more public interference. So the way in which the building was designed has this mesh that can be completely opened, and when there is a public performance, the whole street and the whole city of Muharraq becomes the backstage of the performance space and becomes in some way the audience of the performance. In addition to, you know, all these more infrastructural and in some parts monumental projects, a very big part of the work that we have done is actually working on the urban fabric itself. So we have a component of the project called the facade upgrade, where we are just working on, let's say, doing 50 years of maintenance that hasn't been done in the city to remove protruding ACs, remove advertisements that have been put in shop, to re-reveal the original urban fabric throughout the city. We also have a pilot project, which is really important, with the Ministry of Housing in Bahrain to reintroduce, where possible, social housing within the city center for people that already have houses in Muharraq that would have been allocated social housing in other parts of the city. So to work to rehabilitate these structures. And I think, you know, one of probably the most beautiful aspects of the project is the part of the project that we didn't design or decide on. And it's the way that through these interventions in the city, the way that the people that live in Muharraq have completely transformed their relationship to the city and their relationship to the public space. So Marlène is telling me there's 5 minutes, so I will go very fast. So these are just to give you a glimpse of some of the heritage projects that we worked on throughout, and I will end with the last one, which is the Siyadi Pearl Museum, which was done by Anne, that was completed just a few months ago.
The 5 minutes is for both of us, or
Do it fast, just show the video.
okay.
Hey, we were two, so we were supposed to have double.
No, this is the last. This is the last part. So I hope there's a little bit of energy left. This is also the last project I did in Bahrain, and we don't have any work anymore in Bahrain. This, happily, I didn't want to become a state architect because in this presentation it starts to look like it, which I'm not. We do a lot of work now in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Palestine, and the rest of the world. So, but this is a project that's very dear to my heart, as what I tried to explain already with the post office was, you know, how do you respond to something that already has such a history and has already such a time present, and how to continue on that, how to build up a dialogue. I also had quite a kind of, when I started on this project, was for me, when I started working on this type of projects, was for me the first time to really directly respond to, in dialogue to, an historic architecture. So I had quite some Carlos Carpa fantasies on this, but I, of course, had to figure it out myself. And in the plan, what you see here, the thicker wall, is when we were commissioned for this project. This is the Siyadi. This is built by the Siyadi family, and it consists of a family house, a mezlis. So a mezlis is a kind of meeting room, mostly for men, you know, to do business and to arrange family matters or things like that, and a mosque that was built for the community around. And the two parts that you see here on the bottom, it's the mosque, and on the top part, it's the mezlis. And when we started with the renovation, basically it was actually a lot of demolition, because there were a lot of renovations done in the 70s and 80s that were like inventions of history. They were built as if they looked like the old building. It was very difficult for everyone to distinguish what was now really old and what was new. So we took quite a bit of time, we took actually quite a few years to figure out what are still the old remains, and the rest, we were very radical in it. We just completely removed it, which gave us then also the possibility to add something to it that is distinctively new but builds upon it. And builds upon it is mainly in the plan. It's of course it's a fantasy built upon, because we don't know what was there. But on the existing walls, we elongated them. We closed courtyards that were then having a missing wall, etc. To continue to build in plan exactly or more or less like the old building. This is the entrance. So when you come from the entrance door into this mezlis, you have on the left side, you have the historic architecture, on the right side, the new building. So this is the entrance courtyard. The materiality is exactly the same. So what you see as the lime plaster on the old building is also the lime plaster on the new building. And when we were engaging in the crafts of how these lime plasters were built, they are built in 2 layers. So first layer is with the hand and they're thrown on the wall. And the second layer is a refined layer that is kind of plastered over to make a smooth wall. And we decided in the new building to leave these two layers visible and make that the kind of the new ornamentation of the building. These are the entrance doors and also all the windows of the new building. It's a glass that we have slumped. It's a kind of kiln forming technique on sand. So it takes the properties of the sand and the form of the sand and therefore becomes non-transparent, but it lets the light in. And I thought for me it was very important in an Islamic architecture to have not the gaze through the window, but to have always be in a space where the light falls in, but you do not watch out, or you do not bring space in relationship to an exterior space. But that light was also really important for showcasing the pearl jewelry, because this became the Pearl Museum. Pearls are, the natural pearls are also always viewed in natural light. So when the pearl merchants work with pearls, they sit with a desk next to a window, and they can in Bahrain work until like 3 in the afternoon. And they can observe the pearls, the luster, the shine, etc., only by the natural light. So for me it was important that we then make it a museum that is completely focused on daylight, and that the daylight always comes from the side and falls on the showcase and on the jewelry, and therefore we can see in the same kind of way how the pearls are observed, also be seen by the visitor. These pearls, and especially pearls in this size, are extremely rare. So the big necklace probably cost around 30 years to collect, because you need to find pearls with identical color, the identical luster, the identical size to make the symmetry of a pearl necklace. So there's another aspect. I mean, there's a lot of aspects where time is so much present in its value creation, you could say, of it, you know, where time is an enhancement of something. And then when you go up, I have to speed up, when you go up, you walk in the main room, the kind of trophy room of the space. And that trophy room, we wanted to, it's an 8-meter high space. It's finished, all the interior space are finished in that kind of same way of plaster, but we finished it with a silver leaf. So real silver leaf is brushed on the walls and on the ceiling. And silver is something that is a material that is very responsive to salt in the air, humidity in the air, other impurities in the air, and therefore will respond to it. I mean, with your silver cutlery, you know if you don't polish it, it will stain. And what we did was to start that process, because it's a process that never stops, but to start that process, we bought black salt on the market. We put some cooking pans on stoves in the space, and I think this was like a few days, no, a week maybe maximum before the opening. The whole space, its whole appearance started altering. So that's what, you know, what we have worked on. I think this project we have worked on for maybe 8 years. In one night, while cooking salt changed completely its appearance. And I find it very beautiful that in architecture, such a directness and such a risk and such a great possible of failure, because we didn't know exactly what would happen, was all at the same time at play. And that is, this is the current state of that space. But since we didn't seal that silver will continue to respond, so that a presence of a specific climate of being here in Bahrain or there in Bahrain has a direct response on its architecture. And that is then also used as the backdrop for the pearls. Then I walk you out of it to a part of old and new, to end with the mejlis itself, which is, this is one of the last traditional architectures, let's say, in Bahrain, but with an enormous refinement, you could say, with a, I see Farouk sitting like, yeah, but here in Iran we have a lot more refinement. for for the Gulf, an enormous refinement. No, I find very beautiful plaster cast that are not cast, sorry, plaster carvings, all built in coral stone, but also the space that for the first time could be bigger than normal because steel arrived to the island and a certain kind of modern. It's not only traditional; it is also modern in its presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Do you have any? Est-ce que ouais, bon, si. Do you have any question? Ouais.
I just want to say thank you so much for the presentation. It was really nice. And I had actually two questions. First of all, you talked about like avoiding musifying a bit like the Pearl Path, and I wanted to know how did you like avoid maybe like gentrification or like ensure like some kind of security of like, I don't know, people leaving or like all that. And I also had a question about materiality because I'm not sure about the materiality of a lot of the projects. And also I'm not sure about Bahrain, but I would say it's a lot of limestone or maybe rock that is abundant. And I was wondering about like the choice of concrete, like is it like for durability reasons that you chose using concrete or yeah, that's kind of my two questions. I
can answer the first question. I think we did several things. So first of all, the zoning that we did before we started the project made sure that, for example, commercial areas are only reserved to the Su area as they were traditionally, so that the rest of the neighborhoods, like is traditionally in Islamic city, remain residential. Islamic cities generally are not mixed use, let's say, you know, for privacy issue, for many issues. So we made very sure that there was, when the project eventually finishes and takes a life of its own where we're not involved, that there are the legal procedures in place to make sure that gentrification, I mean, you can never avoid gentrification, but at least that it can be controlled in some specific areas. Second of all, we did not expropriate in the project. So wherever it was possible, most of the houses that you see were done with the original owners. So we have an agreement with the original owners that the government will renovate the homes and then they will be run in partnership with the families. So as much as possible, we own maybe, I think, only 4 or 5 properties along the whole path. The whole Su area is still privately owned. Most of the large houses are also privately owned. So that was another real important factor that we took in place. And maybe for the materiality.
So that works, yeah. I mean, I also teach this in my chair at the ETH, the focus on material sourcing, material application. And I think it is really important to consider where you are in the world. Because what might fit, what might be very logical or what may be very sustainable to use in one place is not at all in another place. Like the use of wood in Bahrain is a very unsustainable use. So I mean, my students, I mean, I feel sometimes it's a very beautiful period to live in now because we are questioning so strongly the materiality of things. It's also a very difficult period because there's so many dogmas on it at the same time. So wood is good, concrete is bad, etc. But it doesn't help if you do not include the location of a place. Bahrain is a country that is very tiny. It's a very tiny island. It always was based on import and export of goods and also of materials. So all the wood that you see in the historic projects would come from outside. So it would come from India or East Africa and was imported as fixed windows, ready, completely ready, with doors, everything in it, the carvings, etc., and would be installed. So what came from Bahrain was the coral stone, which now logically is protected. We want to preserve the oyster beds, etc., so we can't use that anymore. And a little bit of limestone that was quarried from the center of the island, which was a very soft limestone that could not be used directly for construction, but could be used for lime plaster, is also protected because it's depleted. So that is a kind of context that you have to work from. So what we try to do is to build upon, but you have to build upon its current state. One thing that we use a lot is aluminium, as Bahrain has one of the largest aluminium smelters present. Another one is obviously concrete as a construction material, which I think still now today is a very good construction material. Plaster, but also the way how we form these materials and how we can form these materials in the most efficient way. For instance, in the souk you saw the sand casting on the concrete, so that all that concrete is casted with a very minimum amount of formwork, etc. So to bring the presence of place in all of these aspects forward, I think is very important to work with.
Thank you. I have a short question. It's very ambitious, all these interventions in a small area. I'm curious about the impact it has on the local scene in architecture, and also maybe with the schools of architecture. What has been the receptions of all this by the local scene?
I mean, I grew up in Bahrain, but I've been working there since 2010. 2009. So in 2010, I worked on Bahrain's first participation at the Biennale called Reclaim, and I worked with it also with Leo, and we worked with a lot of university students from the University of Bahrain. And it was an interesting project, and we was very engaged with the university and the architecture education system. And so I can see very much the way in which the local scene has developed from 2010 to 2024 today. We always try in many different ways to engage the university students, the local architecture scene, and so on. But the limitation that we had, and that I realized early on, was that, in order for there to be good critical architects, let's say, you need to have a good education of architecture. I mean, architects come out of an ecosystem, they're not produced on their own. It comes because there's strong education, there's a system of public commissioning and so on. And we, when we started working with Sheikh Hamay at the Ministry of Culture and so on, and we had these ambitions for architecture, you understand that you're only a small part of that ecosystem. And what you can influence is from within that specific realm that you're working on. We tried very early on engaging more with the university, and it was at that moment difficult. We were not able, and we were spending a lot of energy doing something that was outside of our scope. I mean, we were not the Ministry of Education, so we were not mandated to do that. But what we did understand is that building architecture in let's say, a challenging way is also a form of education. And when university students, architecture students in Bahrain start seeing different alternatives built in their country and start seeing these as also an example that's there, this also starts challenging their way of practicing. And this was quite beautiful because quite early on, although we had started with very small projects, we started getting approached by university students saying, our professor asked us to study a cultural building. We saw this new building that you built. Could you send us the plans? Can we have a look at it? Can we understand? And we see now, 10 years on, it's true that we've built a lot, that this has brought a very different architecture scene in Bahrain. And today there are a lot, architects that are producing really interesting work, some that work with us on the team, on the Pearling Path. So like Anne said a lot of the work we actually do in-house. So we actually, we do a lot of conservation work, some small projects. We also design in-house. And it's also creating a younger generation that's a lot more critical, and also critical of us, which is very good. And I think so now we've reached a point where if I had started in the scene that we are in today, we would have done things differently. So, but this was not the case 15 years ago. But, I'm hopeful to think that what has built has contributed to this change as well, along with many other things, of course. I mean, we're in Bahrain, but the whole region has changed a lot, so.
Thank you. Pardon.
I mean, I came to Bahrain 10 years ago and I started my studio there. At that time, I was still considered a young architect, and now sadly seems not anymore. But what for me was very important is to bring people in the studio that are from there. So I didn't want to, import collaborators with their best CVs. For me, it was much more important to feel that something that is being built up from scratch at the place. And it was literally built up from scratch because my first office space was the secretary room of Noura, that was 3 by 3 meter. And there we worked on, and the first presentation that we gave to the Minister of Culture was in the kitchen and the laundry space of that building, because we didn't have space. But for me, it felt like, you will go to somewhere else, you pack your suitcase, you arrive there, and you start basically from scratch again on all these levels. And I thought I do that with people that I meet, that are directly around me. And now, at this moment, 10 years later, there's people that have started their own offices. There's, for instance, the Bahraini Danish collective that is quite well known for their design work and presenting all over the world. And they are all offsprings from that start of that studio. And I think that is, just to support what Noura is saying, I think that is the aim. It doesn't start immediately, but over quite a small period of time, you really see a difference there.
Thank you. Maybe we take a last question.
C'était plutôt une remarque supplémentaire sur la question de la sustainability que vous avez posée, sur la question de l'usage des matériaux et entre autres du béton. Et moi, ce que j'aurais aimé ajouter, c'est la question de la main-d'œuvre. Parce qu'il y a la question des matériaux qu'on utilise sur les chantiers, mais il y a aussi la question des conditions de travail des ouvriers qui travaillent sur les chantiers. Et moi, ce que j'aurais aimé ajouter, c'est que l'expérience de travailler là-bas, puisqu'on a été invité par Noura, c'est aussi la question d'un incroyable savoir-faire de la main-d'œuvre sur les chantiers. Et curieusement, c'est vraiment bottom-up, c'est-à-dire c'est les gens qui font le travail manuel, qui ont un savoir et un travail traditionnel. Et je pense que ce qu'on a construit là-bas, je ne suis pas sûre qu'on arriverait à le construire en Suisse. Et c'est aussi des choses qui donnent pas mal à réfléchir aussi sur la façon dont on travaille, et dans la façon dont on travaille et on développe des techniques de travail dans un milieu qui est différent. Et que la question, disons que Anne l'a dit, il faut faire attention de ne pas être trop idéologique, et il faut vraiment repenser la façon dont on travaille en prenant en compte tous les facteurs, y compris les facteurs humains, parce que c'est vraiment important aussi, des gens qui travaillent des fois dans des conditions difficiles, de respecter la façon dont ils travaillent et ce que ça signifie, et aussi la durabilité à propos du béton, puisque nous, on a construit en béton, dans un climat qui est quand même brutal, avec les tempêtes de sable, avec l'air salé, de proposer quelque chose qui résiste et quelque chose qui n'est pas obsolète au bout de 5 ou 10 ans.
It could be a whole conference, this topic, because there's more that I also thought of that I wanted to say, but maybe that's another conference. Yes.
Next time. Okay, so, thank you very. Alors donc voilà.